From Studio 18 in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, this is In Studio with Susan Minuk.
My next guest was an award-winning arts journalist with the Globe and Mail for 16 years. He has penned biographies on Canadian icons like Mordechai Richler and Anne Murray. He recently completed a 3-volume biography book series on Leonard Cohen. Here to talk all about it is Michael Posner. Welcome, Michael. Let's start with this. Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016, and many Leonard Cohen fans from around the world felt that the Canadian poet was overlooked due to lack of international exposure. Where do you stand on this?
It's an interesting question. I think the Nobel Committee wanted to try to remain relevant in the modern world, and they were looking for a big name figure who wasn't necessarily a writer per se. And they chose Dylan, who is, compared to Leonard, much more popular, much more commercial, much better known internationally. Leonard had a wonderful career, but he wasn't, in commercial terms, as successful as Dylan. So that choice made sense for the Nobel Committee. What they might have considered doing was giving the award to both of them, as they do in other fields of the Nobel, in physics and chemistry and economics. They often give 2 awards, so they might have done that. They didn't. I agree. There's lots of people who think Leonard deserved it, and there's lots of people who think Dylan deserved it. So it's a difficult question to answer.
So with a 3-part book series under your belt, Michael, you are now one of the literary experts on the life and times of Leonard Cohen. What do you think was the biggest misconception or misunderstanding about this enigmatic poet?
I'm not sure I'd call it a misconception exactly. I think, in the modern world, there's a tendency to reduce everything to kind of binary choices. To somebody's a saint or a sinner, or they're good or bad, and social media fuels these divisions and polarities. I think we know Leonard. Most of us now know Leonard as the old man. The graceful, charming, the guy who toured the world for 5 years at the end of his life, and he was all of those things: charming and intelligent and very generous soul, and he was all of those things. At the same time, he was a human being with lots of messiness in his life, conflicts with women, conflicts with his children. It wasn't a smooth sailing for him, and of course he battled depression for much of his adult life. So it's that reduction that I think is in error, not necessarily a misconception, just a tendency to kind of simplify who he was. He was a very complicated guy. So,
Michael, what messiness are you referring to?
Well, he was a guy who had a large appetite for women. He was often juggling relationships with different women, 2 or 3 at the same time. This created problems for him and conflict. There were many women who wanted to have his children who he didn't want to have more children, and so there were a lot of abortions in his life. His children gave him problems at various times, although he was later in life able to kind of resolve those for the most part and come to terms with issues. So there were a number of areas in his life that were messy, and of course, as I say, he had this I don't know if it was clinically bipolar, but he battled depression, very deep depression for decades. And nothing he tried, whether it was sex or alcohol or drugs or Zen Buddhism or Kabbalah, nothing resolved that depression. So that's what I mean by messiness.
Why do you think it didn't resolve?
I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not a psychologist. He lost his father when he was 9 years old. I think that left a hole in his life that was essentially unfillable. Some of the men in his life, Irving Layton, the Canadian poet, his Zen master, Sasaki Roshi, became kind of father figures for him later on. But I think there was for all the wonderful aspects of his lyrics and the romance that's buried within them, I'm not sure that he as a human being was able to connect as well to people as he might have even wanted to. And he did talk about this quite candidly, So there was a hole there that I think was essentially unfillable.
Michael, you say that Leonard didn't connect with people as well as he wanted to. Do you see yourself in that? way?
Oh, I think everybody has certain gaps in their life, areas where they would like to improve on. On the other hand, of course, I have 2,500 Facebook friends, most of whom I've never met. I don't know. I don't want to be too glib about it. Sure, in some ways, I probably do relate to Leonard. Maybe there's some connection. Maybe that's why I've been so fascinated in delving into his life. I'm not sure.
So Cohen, he was well known for performing in obscure venues, often at military bases, in hospitals, and in psychiatric wards. And it seemed he always gravitated to the fringes of society and to people who were suffering in one form or another. Michael, why did he prefer these places, maybe over mainstream venues where he could shine his brightest?
Well, I'm not sure that he preferred them. He was, first of all, his own depression made him, I think, somewhat sympathetic to people who had, liabilities, psychiatric liabilities. So that's an aspect. He was sympathetic. I think he felt that many of these people, although they're on the fringes of society, are in many ways savants or operating at a very high psychic level, and they're marginalized by society. But there's nothing fundamentally wrong with them. And the other aspect of it, and this is quite interesting actually, is that he felt as a performer, when you performed in a psychiatric hospital, say as he did in England and the United States and Canada, you got a very authentic response. You know, if they didn't like you, they let you know it immediately, and it was very genuine. And so you knew instantly whether you were passing the test as a performer, and I think he appreciated that.
So if you met Leonard Cohen today, and you handed him a copy of your volumes, what do you think he'd say?
Interesting question. In 1973, the Shaw Festival put on a show called Sisters of Mercy, and they had a young man who was part of the band, and he was an aspiring songwriter at the same time. And Leonard approached him, and they started chatting. And the young man, he said, "How many songs have you written?" And he said, 50. And he says, "Oh, you slouch." And so I can imagine Leonard coming to me and saying, "How many interviews did you do for my book?" And I'd say, I don't know, 500, 550. "Oh, you slouch." I'm not sure what he would say. I hope he would say, it's a balanced and an attempt at a nuanced portrayal of my life. It's not biased. There are overwhelmingly the people in this book and the other two books speak very well of him. There are some detractors, there are some naysayers. He couldn't please everybody. Some women were embittered and disappointed by their relationship with him. But I would hope that he would say this is an attempt at a balanced portrait.
You have a new book, your last book in this volume. When is it coming out?
November 22nd.
November 22nd. Amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And thank you really for being our guest here.
Thank you.
Looking forward to reading
Well, thank
more
you for
about
having
Leonard
me.
Cohen.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
You're watching In Studio with Susan Minuk.
Canadian Jewish TV is brought to you by Album Equipment Rentals, the MPL Modular Film and Audio Studios, Tom's Place, Key West Video, and Chairman Mills. The Elevator Show and In Studio are signatures of Canadian Jewish TV.